And so with enormous admiration, I wish to introduce to all of you our keynote speaker tonight, Esther Duflo, truly a revolutionary and also truly a humane person. Esther.
Thank you very much. Thank you, MIRA, for this wonderful honor, which I'm going to display. I suppose someone would have given it to me, so it came in a mail, so I'm very happy to give it to myself. Thank you, Eric, for this wonderful introduction. I worry it's going to be downhill from there. I must say things have radically changed since we met. I met Eva for the first time in Eric's house, and we had a wonderful dinner discussing the problems of the world. It is not that there weren't any problems then, and I'm going to go back to that. But of course, two major things happened since then. First, there was the COVID crisis, which, as Eva pointed out, has exacted an absolutely disproportionate toll on Latinx communities, other migrant communities, and African American communities. I've been doing a project with almost 70 doctors at MGH to try and understand just a small part of it, which is the lack of trust that exists between both communities and the health system, and in particular, the ingrained worry, fear that exists among African Americans that they will not be treated well, and among Latinx that they might be deported. There were many aspects of this project that were very striking. Some of them were hopeful. For example, the fact that if you get doctors to convey messages about the symptoms of COVID, the ways of transmission, and how to prevent transmission, how to protect yourselves and your loved one. We did that as part of an experiment. And when we did this experiment, we found that this is quite effective, that those doctors are very effective. But one of the very sad facts that came out of it is that there is a profound fear among Latinx that their information could be given. The second really disturbing fact is that there is nothing we could say to assure them that this wouldn't happen, simply because there is no guarantee that hospitals have that the information cannot be shared in the subpoena. That might be true in isolated cases, but in general, if you want to address the Latinx community nationwide, you can never guarantee that this information is not going to be used against them. So that's the first thing that happened. In Boston in particular, the Chelsea community has been hit so hard by this disease that this is something that really left me reeling. And then of course, there were the 3 murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd that combined has finally given rise to the outrage that Eric was discussing, but that of course come on the heel of decades of such events. And I'm sure whether one needs to be distressed now or one needs to be hopeful now, because in some sense, very unfortunately, none of these murders are news, but the reaction to it, both the scale of the protest and also the reaction of the broader public to it is news. So there might be some figment of hope in that, in terms of action for the future. It's really all about action. As Eric was saying, I don't believe that there is fatalism of either economics or politics, that situations are the way they are because of some deep system that is not changeable. The systems are hard to change, but they can be changed. Unfortunately, neither the outsized toll that the COVID has had on the African American Latinx community, nor the 3 recent murders are isolated incidents. Unfortunately, they are coming as the emerged part of the iceberg of what some people call structural racism, and is generally both a different economic treatment of both African Americans and migrants, and of deep mistrust that exists in some quarters among not everybody, but in some quarters of the native population towards both of these communities. There again, one could say, well, you know, it's not economic fatalism, but it's political fatalism. Racism is ingrained, it's coming from the history of this country. But I also don't believe that. I think this is in some sense, for many people, the only way that they have to make sense of what is happening to them. America likes to think of itself as the country of opportunities. This is a country where migrants like me can come and, you know, work in university and get Nobel Prizes. This is the countries where people can move from bad jobs to good jobs, and and there is lots of intergenerational mobility. So even the poor, even if they stay poor, their children will stay rich. Unfortunately, this story that we are telling ourselves as a nation isn't quite true anymore. In fact, it is now much less true in the US than it is in Europe. So if you take a child who is born of poor parents in the bottom 20% of the population, in terms of income distribution, their probability to make it out of the bottom 20 and their probability to make it into the top 20 is lower. Both of those probabilities are lower than the same number in Europe. This used to be the opposite. But today, social mobility is actually lower in the US. However, people's beliefs of social mobility is very high. So people still live in the dream that their kids can succeed. And in some sense it's good, and in some sense it's bad, because although they have this sense in general, they are not fools and they can see that things are not going well for them. And when I say that things are not going well for them, despite this illusion that is repeated to them all the time, then they very naturally are looking for an explanation. And this is where political entrepreneurs, who shall remain unnamed because even pronouncing their names would make me sad, can use this need for an enemy to promote a discourse that is both anti-African American and anti-migrants. And the subtlety of the discourse are somewhat different when the two communities are concerned, but it really comes from the same place. It's coming from the idea that there is only one pie and it's a big one, but there is someone else who is eating it away from you. And unfortunately, this is a discourse that seems very intuitive. You know, if people think of the economy as a big pie, if there are more people to eat from that pie, there will be less for me. Or more specifically, if you're thinking about people looking for jobs, if there are more people who need a job, then of course the wages will be lower, or I will be more likely to be unemployed. Now, it turns out that it's not the way economy works. For example, if you look at the migrants, when they come to a city, they work very hard. They take the jobs that no one wants to take. They consume things that other poor people produce. So that on balance, across now dozens and dozens of studies, there is simply no evidence that migrants take away jobs or lead to lower salary for the native population. In fact, if anything, it goes the other way. And in fact, efforts that have been made before this administration to kick out migrants so that the native population can have jobs have totally backfired. For example, in the 1960s, when they sent back the braceros home by removing their visas, the hope was that it would create jobs for low-skilled native in California. But what happened instead is that agriculture was mechanized so that no one had any sort of a job. So there was no positive effect of that. So that is what we are learning from years, decades of experience with migrants, but that's not what people have in the back of their mind. And of course, as I was saying, this is in part because this narrative are both intuitive and very convenient for some set of people. So you might take away from that this is all quite depressing and there is really nothing to do. And but as Eric said, that's not my outlook on life. And I've been reflecting on this outlook in the last few weeks. The last few weeks have been difficult for everyone. I'm amazingly privileged, so they have not really been difficult for me. But in some sense, they have been so easy for me that I've been feeling extremely guilty as to how lucky I am. And I've been reflecting at, have I just been in some sense given nice awards and given some rewards to say nice things about the disadvantaged people without ever really making any sort of a dent? And am I in some sense profiting from people's and happiness in some other way? And that's not a good place to go. And I had the occasion to reflect on this because I was asked to give some small remarks to the graduating students from MIT. And I quoted to them from a kid's book that my children like, which is called Dogman. If you have kids, you probably have read Dogman. And in this book, there is a mechanical fish who decides to become the nanny of 20 tadpoles who have become orphaned for a series of unfortunate events. And two characters are discussing that, and little Petey, a little cat, says to his dad, "See, I told you he was a good guy, he's changing the world." And his dad cat says, "Well, I don't know if he's changing the world, this is just 22 tadpoles." And little Petey says, "Well, it is changing their world." And I find a lot of comfort in this story. A more dignified way to say the same thing is Martin Luther King quotes that the arc of moral justice is long, but it bends towards justice. If you're looking at the last 30 years, even including the COVID times, the lives of the poor has greatly improved. Infant mortality has been divided by 2. Poverty rates had been divided by 2, although I'm sure they're going to climb up again. Maternal mortality has been divided by 2. Almost every child is in school. And this is the result not of one big stroke. This is the result of a series of good policy decisions, which themselves are the result of a lot of experiments, some of them successful, some of them failing. So the war on poverty, and I will extend this to the war against racism, the war against bigotry, the fight for social justice, is very much like the war on cancer. It's not one big, beautiful battle where you have solved the problem. It's a series of steps, some in the right direction, some in the wrong direction, which progressively leads to improvements. And we are certainly not in the forward step although I am sure that something will emerge from this. You work, one migrant at a time, one community at a time. It's very much like tadpoles. And at the same time, being a coalition, you have the possibility, like we try to do also in my lab, to build from those tadpoles and say, what have we understood? How can we move forward from what we've learned today? So we have to continue, one step at a time. Keep the hope, keep the rigor, but keep the emotions as well, and not forget why we are doing what we are doing. Thank you so very much.